morning to all of you. So based on a suggestion from Rasmus, I will make a focus on food products within the French experiment and on the communication aspects. Just before starting the presentation, a couple of preliminary remarks. You have to keep in mind that the French experiment, the environmental labeling initiative, really started from a consumer-oriented perspective. And it was interesting, for example, to see the difference with the perspective that initiated the project in Quebec, as presented by Peter yesterday. At the beginning, there were no debates about potential competitiveness for companies or whatever. The objective was really to give consumers some information to help them identify the green products and to help companies design such green products. So it was very much consumer-oriented. That being said, we've invested a lot in methodology, in establishing PCRs, in debating what would be the perfect database, etc., but not so much on communication. Whereas, and I know some of you, of course, share this idea, you can not separate communication and methodology and verification. Because if you start communicating information, then comes comparison, and then you ask the question, is the comparison relevant? And that means you have to take into account the methodology and the verification in the global picture. And one of the surprising things in what has been done in France since the last 3 years is that probably we've invested several man-years in working groups debating about methodology, probably a couple of millions from public institutions in projects to build a tool, to build a database, etc., but almost nothing on communication. And I think we should really start before it's too late, because I really think to some point, the less we work on communication, the more we will have to work on methodology. If I may quote Jean-Christophe from Danone, until the moment where you don't know if your products might end up with a green light or a red light, you might get nervous on what's the methodology, what will be the verification process. So I think that you have to pay attention to have some kind of balance between the work that will be done on methodology and the work that will be done on this communication aspect also to consumers. So quick introduction on who we are. In fact, now we're very small group of 2 companies. The historical one, Biointelligence Service, is a consultancy based in Paris, created in 1989 with about 65 consultants. And we're working mostly on life cycle assessments, carbon footprint of companies, products on one side. On the other side, working on assessment of environmental public policies, whether that would be for the European Commission or for the French or British Ministries of Environment. And now we have a new company in the group, which is called Green Next, which started on environmental labeling issues in 2007. And it's a software editor that created a software which target was to conduct what we may call sometimes industrialized LCAs to provide retailers or companies with cost-effective solution for assessment of large number of retail products. Our collective experience with environmental labeling is mostly in France. We've worked with 3 of the 5 leaders in retail sector, Casino, Leclerc, and Les Mousquetaires. We've worked for the public authorities, and of course we've worked with a couple of companies within the context of the environmental experimentation. So this is just a reminder. Antonin mentioned it also yesterday. Just another reminder of the future process that will be used by companies to make the assessment of their product. So basically, it starts with the LCA ISO norms, from which was derived the AFNOR BPX30 323, which is our French norm on environmental labeling. Currently, we're in the process of establishing all the PCRs that are needed to deal specifically with the different product categories. And sometime in the future, either 2013 or beyond, we should have a public database that companies will have to use, and there should be also a web-based assessment tool that companies might use. That is to say, companies could either use their own assessment tool. We will need some discussions on how to make sure that a kind of private tool is compliant with the public tool, but companies will have the possibility either to use the public tool or something else. In a couple of words, the BPX 30323 gives you the basics of the methodology, specifies that carbon footprint is mandatory for all product categories, but then the other environmental indicators should be chosen according to what is considered as the most relevant environmental issues for a specific category. And of course, these PCRs should deal with functional units, allocation rules, what are the generic data that everybody should use, the specific data for which companies should look for their own activity data, etc., etc. So far, as I mentioned, two issues have not been explored or discussed at the French level: a potential harmonized format or harmonized communication rules, and a potential verification process of this data. When companies started to prepare the national experiment, that was early 2011, there was no PCR available for food products. The only thing we had was some consensus on the fact that the most relevant environmental issues for food products were carbon, water, and biodiversity. But the companies which started to prepare their participation to the French experiment had nothing more to comply to, so to say. Functional unit was more or less stabilized with either 100 grams or a portion if there exists a consensus on what a portion should be for this specific subcategory. And of course, we were missing a lot of guidelines on allocation rules and other methodological aspects. No guidelines had been given either for communication. The only thing is that the ministry strongly encouraged companies not to use web-based communication only, but to try to communicate either on the packaging or on the shelves so that consumers would have some kind of physical contact with the information. So what I'm going to present now are a few of the initiatives that I consider the most significant within the 70 companies, more or less, of the food and beverage sector that took part in the experiments. Briefly, as Antonin mentioned yesterday, more than 160 companies in total, about 70 from food products or beverage. The communication channels that were chosen, for a majority of them, was web, but still a significant number use either some information directly on the point of sale or on the product, whether that would be directly on the packaging or, for example, on the label. The 5 initiatives I'm going to present with a little bit more detail are the 2 initiatives that have been taken by some of the leading retailers in France, namely Casino and Les Mousquetaires. So Casino, as you know, was the kind of historical leader on environmental labeling, starting with the carbon index that you can see there on some of the products in 2008. And Les Mousquetaires, so to say, was a kind of new entrant on this environmental labeling theme. Then some initiatives from two specialized retailers, which are both leaders in their segment in France, one on organic products, the other on frozen products. And finally, an initiative led by a non-profit organization called ILEC, which regroups the major brands, I would say, which worked on coordinating the communication format between its members. As you will see, between all these different initiatives, you will have different choices regarding whether or not we should use a unique score at the end of the process to communicate with the consumer, whether biodiversity should be part of the set of indicators we use, taking into account that there exists no consensus at the moment on the methodology, and whether, for example, the format you will choose might give the possibility to differentiate only product categories between them, or also products within a specific product category. So starting with the example of Casino. Casino started in 2008, so that was before we had any guidelines or methodology defined. And of course, just because of the fact that it was carbon footprint only, it was not compliant with the new BPX 323. And what Casino wanted was still to have some kind of unique score at the end to communicate to consumers, to have a flexible approach, because we knew from the beginning that the methodology would be adopted in the future. And they really wanted to allow specific product comparison, because their objective is to make sure that suppliers go for eco-design initiatives. The result is there in terms of variety of products. The difference with the carbon index is that with this environmental index, we had both Casino products, but also national brand products, which used the methodology designed with Casino. So quite rapidly, the idea on the final score is that each of us has some kind of environmental budget in relation to its food consumption. We know, for example, at the moment in France, food consumption is responsible for 1.5 tons of CO2 emissions per year. So we're able to say that this product is 5, 10, or 20% of your daily emissions. And so we use the same principle, of course very much comparable to what exists in nutrition, to give a final score to products. And it allows some, differentiation between product categories, but also subcategories with different meat products, or specific products within categories. Of course, you can challenge me on the uncertainty behind the figures, etc. Just keep in mind that this is some kind of private ecosystem where we assess the products for Casino with the same set of data. And of course, you could not compare these figures with the figures arising from the initiative from Intermarché, for example, because we don't have enough alignment at the moment. Another one is Picard. They also decided to go for a unique score at the end of the process, which is at the bottom of the slide. Again, they have 3 environmental indicators, different ones. They've made a decision to include biodiversity. And at the end, they just make an average and will put your product final score on this colored scale that you can see. ILEC, as I mentioned previously, only worked on aligning the communication formats and the environmental indicators. So they made the decision to go for these 4 environmental indicators you will see, with these specific pictograms that all the companies within the association used afterwards during the experiment. But there was no coordination on the methodological aspects. I'm accelerating a little bit. You'll find some other examples in the document. Just wanted to share with you the results of some consumer surveys that were conducted by participants to the experiment. The first one I wanted to share, thanks to Levi's, is a consumer survey where the question was asked to consumers on which product categories would you look always or often for some environmental information. And the results are that we have something like 4 food categories in the top 6 products where a consumer will say, I'm looking for some environmental information there. The first one is fruits and vegetables, with 60% of consumers looking for some information. Then we have cleaning products, but then we have dairy products, and after that we have meat products. So every time a consumer survey asked the consumers what were their priority products when it comes to having some environmental information, food products were amongst the first one. Another survey has been conducted by Casino based on their initiative. So 83% of the consumers confirmed their interest today in the environmental impact of food products. And when asked what objectives, according to them, what was the objective of this environmental labeling scheme, half of them said, okay, that's to inform consumers, but before that, the first objective for them was the responsibility of the brands to improve the environmental impact of their products. In terms of credibility, at this point in time, the environmental information has been estimated as credible by the consumers, but definitely they think it should be reinforced by verification or control, with 30% thinking it is definitely a priority. And another question which seems to be a priority for consumers is the homogeneity of communication formats of information between the different brands. And finally, a vast majority of consumers stated that they would rather have the information directly unpacked. When asked whether they would prefer a unique indicator or a set of indicators, a majority there again stated that they preferred a unique indicator. For information, 35% of the Casino consumers who were interviewed knew the former carbon index that was only 4 years old, so that was not too bad. And compared, for example, to the set of 3 different environmental indicators decided by ELEC, the preference of the consumers was for the unique indicator, and perhaps more important was also the fact that some consumers were getting confused when presented 2 different products with 2 different sets of environmental scores, which product was really the better one. So in terms of communication, what we can say is that probably never before have been consumers that informed about life cycle thinking. You see, I think every company went for its own representation of the life cycle of products, so we hope it would have made a difference. And just a few conclusions, a few final observations or conclusions. So there's definitely a stronger expectation of consumers towards food products with regards to environmental impact information. There's been quite a strong participation from this type of products within the French experiment. I mentioned in the presentation that, for example, Casino had already assessed 300 products and Les Mousquetaires 160, so it starts to build up in the market. A majority of the companies stated that they would likely continue beyond 2013, but with a few exceptions, the majority of them at the moment are waiting for the next phase, that is to say, when the ministry will submit its conclusions to the French Parliament, then we'll know what is the follow-up action or regulation on this. The interesting point also is that some companies already started to develop their own IT solutions to conduct these assessments without waiting for a public tool in the future. And Casino developed a tool which will be open to all companies which are willing to use their tool to make their assessment, whether or not they sell products directly to Casino. And something which is, I think, emerging at the end of this French experiment is that the need for stronger harmonization of communication formats, which, as I mentioned previously, was clearly left behind at the beginning of the experimentation, I think is becoming a growing issue, both from the consumer side and from some companies, just because, for example, they say, listen, if we have to go this way on environmental labeling, we will need some years to educate consumers. And the more we wait to harmonize, for example, communication rules, the more time we will need to educate consumers and to make sure that they understand the information that we deliver and that they take the relevant decisions based on that. That's all. I remain available for questions.